Hey there, and welcome to another video about English fluency and grammar. In today's video, you'll learn how to use the word rather in sentences and the several different meanings that it can have depending on how it's used. Sometimes English learners are confused as to whether to use rather than, or with rather. So let's look into it. Rather can function as an adverb modifying an adjective, a verb, or another adverb, in which case we use it to describe a degree, extent, or intensity. It can also function as an adverb or a predeterminer, emphasizing the intensity of a particular characteristic. Rather than can be a conjunction or preposition used to introduce a choice or preference between two alternatives. With rather functions as a modal verb expressing preference or desire. Let's start with the use of rather as an adverb describing a degree, extent, or intensity of the adjective, verb, or another adverb that it refers to. In this case, rather plays the same role as two other words, quite and fairly.
So the weather is actually rather nice.
For example, she's rather smart. My neighbors are rather annoying. Although this building is very old, it's rather beautiful. In all these examples, we can use quite or fairly instead of rather. For example, she's fairly smart. My neighbors are quite annoying. Although this building is very old, it's quite beautiful. Another way you can use rather is to emphasize the intensity of a particular characteristic.
It must be really far away, which makes drawing it to scale rather a challenge.
For example, let's look at this sentence. It's not simply a hobby, it's rather a passion of mine. Here, rather acts as a predeterminer that contrasts the idea of a mere hobby with a stronger notion of a passion, emphasizing the intensity of the speaker's interest. As a predeterminer, rather is used before the indefinite articles a and an. He's rather a character. It's rather an honor. Here is another example, but with rather used as an adverb. She didn't just like the book, she found it rather captivating. In this sense, rather emphasizes how much she liked the book. Not only did she like it, but she found it captivating and engaging. Let's now look at the word rather as a part of the phrase rather than. It's used to express a choice or preference between two alternatives, to show that one option is preferred over another. Rather than can function as a conjunction. In this case, it's important to maintain parallel structure between the two alternatives being contrasted.
It's what economists call household production, the idea that we can spend time rather than money to meet our needs.
For example, for breakfast, I eat oatmeal rather than cereal. In this particular example, the alternatives are two nouns, oatmeal and cereal. But we may also contrast two verbs or two gerunds. We'll go over such cases next. Because rather than is used to express preference between two alternatives, it is often paired with the verb prefer.
I would much prefer to do this rather than earn a paycheck.
For example, he prefers to walk to work rather than drive. I prefer to go for a walk rather than watch TV. Rather than repair the car, I prefer to buy a new one. Notice that in these particular examples, prefer is followed by the full infinitive verb, which is the infinitive marker to, followed by the base verb, to walk, to buy. On the other hand, rather than is followed by the base verb, drive, repair. It's rather than drive and not rather than to drive. Nevertheless, we have a parallel structure here as we contrast two verbs, walk and drive, go and watch, repair and buy. We can use similar structure to contrast objects in the infinitive clause rather than verbs. I guess I just did it.
I do prefer to stay in nice hotels rather than hostels.
Here is an example. I prefer to have pasta rather than pizza. And we still maintain a parallel structure. The verb have is just implicit after rather than. We can also omit the verb to have and use only the nouns. I prefer pasta rather than pizza. It means the same thing as I prefer pasta over pizza. Here, we contrast two nouns. Prefer refers to pasta, and rather than refers to pizza.
They prefer forest rather than open woodland.
Similarly to contrasting two nouns, we can use the same sentence structure to contrast two gerunds. A gerund functions as a noun and is derived by adding the suffix ing to a verb.
They also prefer sharing things rather than owning them.
For example, he prefers walking to work rather than driving. This means the same thing as our earlier example. He prefers to walk to work rather than drive. Again, we have a parallel structure. We can compare two verbs or two gerunds. The meaning is the same, and you can choose one based on your stylistic preferences. Rather than can also function as a preposition. In this case, it must be at the beginning of a subordinate clause, has to be followed by a gerund, and is interchangeable with the phrase instead of. A subordinate clause is a part of a sentence that is dependent on the main clause. In other words, it cannot stand alone.
Rather than doing experiments one at a time, you did multiple experiments in parallel.
For example, rather than sending an email, I decided to call. She fixed her car by herself rather than waiting for help. What's special about these examples is that in contrast to the previous ones where rather than was used as a conjunction, the two clauses don't have a parallel structure. As an alternative to the structure involving prefer and rather than, you can use the word rather as a part of the modal verb would rather together with the conjunction then. But remember that would rather has to be followed by a bare infinitive. You can change I prefer to in our earlier example to I would rather and substitute rather than with then. And you typically contract I would to I'd rather.
They would rather not delegate than have the conversation.
He'd rather walk to work than drive. This has the same meaning as he prefers to walk to work rather than drive. Here are more examples. Would you rather read a book or listen to an audiobook? I'd rather not talk about this right now. I'd rather have pasta than pizza. Again, remember that would rather is always followed by the bare infinitive. That is, by the base form of the verb without the infinitive marker to. I'd rather have, not I'd rather to have. I'd rather read, not I'd rather to read. I'd rather not talk, not I'd rather not to talk. If we want to express a preference for an action that took place in the past, we need to follow with rather by a verb in its perfect infinitive form.
I think that students would have rather had an F than deal with those stories again.
For example, he'd rather have eaten dinner at home. Another use of would rather that might be a little confusing is when it's followed by a subjunctive clause, subject followed by a verb in the past tense. We use this form to express our preference or wishes.
I would rather you just said thank you.
For example, I'm busy on Saturday. I'd rather you came on Sunday. I haven't told my mom about my new job yet. I'd rather you didn't mention it to her now. Notice that even though we're using the past tense form here, the expressions following I'd rather convey our wishes for something to happen in the future. Yet another way to contrast two alternatives is using the pattern like in this example. Rather than drive, he would walk to work.
They would be living through a golden age of theoretical physics rather than the mathematics of theoretical physics.
Another use of rather is as a part of the contrastive conjunction, but rather, which is used to introduce an alternative or contrasting element to the one initially suggested or implied by the negation not.
Consent is not the absence of a no, but rather the presence of a yes.
For example, it's not a matter of quantity, but rather of quality. We can also use rather after the conjunction or rather. We do that when we want to correct or clarify the information of the statement that we have just said.
I would define plagiarism as the use or rather misuse of someone else's ideas.
For example, he's a doctor, or rather, he's studying to become one. He's a minimalist, or rather, he mostly avoids clutter. I listened to her presentation, or rather, I pretended to. Lastly, let's look at 3 common expressions using the word rather. They all have one of the forms that we discussed earlier in this video. The first one, sooner rather than later, is an idiomatic expression used to emphasize the preference or necessity of doing something sooner rather than delaying it.
Better to do it sooner rather than later.
For example, we should fix this issue sooner rather than later. Another common expression is, I'd rather be safe than sorry. It means that I prefer to take precautions in order to avoid potential problems later on. And here is one more. I'd rather die than speak in public. I'd rather die than do something is an idiom used to emphasize extreme aversion or reluctance towards doing something. Friends, I know this is a lot of information, so feel free to go back, pause the video in different places, and go over the examples again. Then come up with your own examples. It's important not only to understand the different uses of rather, but also to put it into practice. In other words, I suggest that you practice rather than just consume the information. After you come up with your own example, I invite you to put it in the comment section below. We always learn better when we share. If you learned something from this video, please click on the like button and subscribe to my channel if you're not a subscriber yet. I'd love to have you in my community. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.